Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving straight into one of the most cinematic, absolutely pivotal periods in all of human history. We're looking at those crucial, nail-biting months where a messy colonial dispute, the kind of unrest that sparked the Boston Tea Party, suddenly transformed into a point of no return, all-out war for independence. The birth of America wasn't just forged in lofty ideals, right? It was forged in blood, freezing winters, and some incredibly desperate decisions. So let's jump right in.
I cannot pretend to describe the horror of the scene. It was streaming with blood and strewed with dead and dying men. Wow. We're skipping the polite introductions today because I really want to plunge you right into the shattered illusion of a peaceful resolution. That visceral quote, that's from a British lieutenant at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it pretty much tells you everything you need to know about the horrifying reality on the ground. The era of polite political debates, totally over. The era of devastating close combat slaughter had officially begun.
But to understand how we actually got to that bloody hill, we kind of have to rewind and look at the timeline. Picture this. It's April 1775. The British Parliament, led by Prime Minister Lord North, actually passes a conciliatory resolution. It was this desperate last-ditch effort to avert a conflict. But here's the catch. This message had to endure a grueling 6-week voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. By the time it finally arrived, completely useless. The time for peace had already passed. Because, as we know, the shooting had famously started at Lexington and Concord, blood had been spilled, the war was officially underway, and honestly, events were moving way too fast for paper treaties to stop them.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer scale of the shock delivered to the British military establishment. It was literally staggering. In June 1775, General Thomas Gage orders this massive frontal assault on Patriot militia positions at Breed's Hill, which of course we now call the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British fully expected this undisciplined rabble to just turn and run. Instead, the casualty numbers from that day are just unbelievable. The highly trained British regulars suffered over 1,000 casualties, around 200 dead and 800 wounded. The Patriots? Despite eventually breaking and retreating, they suffered only about 450 casualties.
So technically, the British won the battle by taking the heights. And yeah, the Patriots suffered a devastating blow by losing their highly charismatic leader, Joseph Warren, who was tragically shot down in that final assault. But listen to this deeply ominous reflection from British General Sir Henry Clinton. He said, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." Talk about a hollow victory, right? This was a massive morale boost for the Americans. They proved without a doubt that they could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest army on earth. The British learned a really hard lesson that day. The fighting spirit of these rebels was incredibly, deeply dangerous.
But as we all know, spirit alone doesn't win wars. Fast forward to July 1775. A wealthy Virginia plantation owner and veteran of the French and Indian War arrives outside Boston to take command of this newly christened Continental Army. His name, obviously, was George Washington. And when he arrived, he found an absolute nightmare. The army was in a deplorable state. I mean, no discipline, no uniforms, barely any basic sanitation. But the most terrifying discovery he made was their ammunition supply. 9. That is the exact number of rounds of gunpowder each man had left to fire. Just 9. They were practically defenseless.
However, to be fair, if we contrast the American struggles, we also have to look at the British logistical nightmare. Think about the number 3,000. That represents the perilous, treacherous miles across the Atlantic Ocean that made up the entire British supply line. The British troops were bottled up in Boston, riddled with smallpox, and just constantly being harassed by American privateers who were swooping in and intercepting their vital shipments of food and weapons. So while Washington desperately lacked gunpowder, the British were facing the very real, very terrifying fear of starvation, which actually ended up leading to the recall of General Gage.
Back in the American camp, Washington had to figure out how to actually command this mess. And to do that, he had to quickly unify this incredibly diverse, fiercely independent-minded group of leaders, along with their completely unruly local militias. His high command was, well, it was an eclectic mix, to put it mildly. You had Nathaniel Greene, this young, self-educated Quaker; Charles Lee, who was a highly experienced but wildly arrogant British career soldier; Israel Putnam, the grizzled old veteran; John Sullivan, a super-aggressive politician; and Horatio Gates, who, get this, secretly held Washington in total contempt. Trying to get these men and their fiercely regional troops to fight for one shared cause, it was a monumental task.
Okay, let's dive into this because this is where Washington really proved his brilliance as an executive leader, bringing some actual order to absolute chaos. First thing he did, he issued sashes and cockadades. Why? Just so the soldiers actually knew who the officers were. It was that disorganized. Second, he dropped the hammer. We're talking severe punishments for desertion, fighting, and believe it or not, even swearing. But step 3? Step 3 is the absolute game changer. A massive smallpox epidemic was raging, so Washington mandates smallpox inoculations for his entire army. This was a spectacularly bold medical directive that likely saved the Continental Army from total destruction by disease before they even had a chance to fight the British.
Now, while Washington was busy organizing the North, a massive social explosion was happening down south. In November 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, issued a decree. He basically offered freedom to enslaved people who took up arms for His Majesty's troops against their rebel masters. You have to remember, roughly half the population in the southern colonies were enslaved, and the white population's absolute greatest fear was a mass uprising. So this incendiary move by the British, it threatened the entire southern plantation economy, and it instantly turned southern landowners into mortal enemies of the British crown. It's so crucial to understand that for many, this war wasn't just about taxes. It was about preserving a strict economic and social hierarchy at literally any cost.
The reaction from the Patriot leaders reveals exactly how deep this societal divide had really become. George Washington famously called Lord Dunmore the arch-traitor to the rights of humanity. And there's a stark, truly tragic irony here, right? Patriots, who were passionately fighting and dying for their own liberty from Britain, were simultaneously condemning this promise of freedom to enslaved Black Americans as a total violation of justice. Hundreds of escaped slaves quickly joined the British to form the Royal Athenian Regiment. And this just perfectly highlights how the war was ripping apart the very fabric of colonial society.
And the destruction of that society, it escalated incredibly rapidly. Dunmore, who was unable to secure reliable supplies, ended up abandoning the Loyalist stronghold of Norfolk, Virginia. And on New Year's Day, 1776, Norfolk burns to the ground. Both sides blamed the other, of course, but the outcome was undeniable. The war was leaving a path of complete, utter devastation. Entire towns were being destroyed, homes were lost, and it was becoming violently clear to everyone involved that there was absolutely no room left to remain neutral. You had to pick a side. Meanwhile, back outside Boston, Washington was facing an existential threat of his own. His troop strength plummeted from its summer peak down to a terrifying 45% by January 1776. The winter siege conditions were just utterly miserable. Men were freezing to death, they were eating raw food because there was literally no wood left to burn. The suffering was inconceivable, and worse, most of their enlistments expired at the very end of 1775. So, despite the desperate pleading of their officers, thousands of men just packed up their muskets and walked home, shrinking Washington's already destitute army to a mere 9,000 men.
You know, it's really important to remember that even amidst all this death, the burning cities, the freezing, the starving, a full break from Britain was still not a universally accepted idea. Moderates in the Second Continental Congress were absolutely terrified of trying to survive in a hostile world without British protection. And this fear resulted in what we call the Olive Branch Petition. Drafted back in July 1775, it was essentially a desperate plea, practically begging King George III to call off his ministers and just restore harmony to the empire. Let's see how this all builds together, because the tragic timeline of these events basically sealed America's fate. The Olive Branch Petition was sent in July, sure, but the horrific news and the maimed soldiers returning from Bunker Hill beat that peace petition to London. Consequently, by August, the king officially declares the colonies in open rebellion. So by the time the king's formal condemnation actually reaches the Americans in January 1776, the bloody events on the ground had drastically outpaced any lingering hopes for a peaceful reconciliation. When the king's address to Parliament finally arrived in those freezing American camps via pamphlets, it was a crushing psychological blow. King George III did not offer an olive branch, not even close. He laid all the blame entirely on the Americans, aggressively condemning their cause as a desperate conspiracy. Even worse, he promised an overwhelming, crushing military response to bring them back to heel. For the American leaders, this was viewed as an absolute, unforgivable betrayal. The very king they had humbly petitioned had turned his back on them entirely. General Nathaniel Greene proclaimed, seeing the British Empire as completely ruined, that America must raise an empire of permanent duration, supported upon the grand pillars of truth, freedom, and religion. This was it. This was the moment the final lingering hopes of reconciliation were completely extinguished. Independence was no longer some radical fringe idea discussed in taverns, it was now a strict matter of survival. So the crucial point here is how George Washington perfectly captured this irreversible shift in momentum.
After the king's open hostility, all those provocations in the South, and the literal rivers of blood shed at Bunker Hill, Washington resolved, we are determined to shake off all connections with a state so unjust and unnatural. The bridge was totally, completely burned. A full, permanent break from Great Britain was now the only acceptable option left on the table.
And this brilliantly illustrates the terrifying reality of early 1776. The Patriots had finally committed to full independence, yes, but committing to a goal and actually achieving it, those are two very, very different things. We are talking about a freezing, undersupplied, wildly divided coalition of farmers and merchants. And across the ocean, Britain was assembling the greatest military machine the world had ever seen to crush them. Which leaves us with one incredibly dramatic question. With that final bridge completely burned, how could a ragtag militia possibly defeat the world's greatest empire? Well, that is the miraculous story of the Revolutionary War, and a perfect place to wrap up this explainer. Keep exploring and never stop questioning the history that shaped our world.